He didn't call her a liar. He called it anxiety and wrote it down. That's how it lasted 4 years. On the drive home from her third appointment, Claire started doing something strange. She began checking if the pain was even real. By the end of this, you'll understand how a system designed to help can train someone to doubt the only witness who was present the entire time. Claire's doctors think she got better. She didn't. At 34, her hands had started shaking and never really stopped. A primary school teacher, the one parents asked for. She didn't complain, not about the commute, not about the marking that followed her home every weekend, not even when the joint pain moved from occasional into frequent, from background noise into something she had to work around just to get through the afternoon. She mentioned it once, carefully, with qualifications, during a routine checkup with Dr. Hoffman. Said it was probably nothing. He ordered blood work. The results came back normal. That word would cost her 4 years. It already had. It didn't feel like they were dismissing her. That's why she didn't fight it. Not at the first appointment. Not at the third. Not even after a full year, when the fatigue started making it difficult to grade papers after 6 p.m. He glanced at the screen, checked the numbers, and said the same thing again. Your levels are well within range. A pause. Then, carefully, have you considered whether stress might be a factor? She had. She considered it again on the drive home. By the time she pulled into her street, she had almost persuaded herself that the problem was probably her. Not because she believed it, because the person with the credentials had been so measured, so unhurried about it, that her uncertainty began to feel like the diagnosis. At the fourth appointment, he didn't order new blood work. He prescribed her a vitamin supplement and asked whether she'd been sleeping. She said yes. She had not been sleeping. Her tests came back normal. That's why it started. She realized something wasn't landing, so she started writing everything down. She'd leave appointments certain she'd communicated clearly, then get home and realize she'd softened everything. Said sometimes when she meant every day. Said uncomfortable when she meant she'd sat in the school bathroom for 10 minutes, waiting for her hands to stop shaking enough to hold a pen. Before her 6th appointment, she sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes, editing a list of 7 symptoms down to 4, removing the ones that sounded like they might confirm the anxiety thesis. She kept the ones that seemed objective. Not because they hurt more, because they were harder to dismiss. She started rehearsing. Bullet points. Facts only. No emotion. Emotion read as confirmation of the anxiety diagnosis. She stopped sounding like a person and started sounding like a file. What changed Claire wasn't the pain. It was what the appointments taught her to do with it. And this is the part that never appears in the chart. They have a word for it now. When it was happening to her, nobody used it where she could hear it. Medical gaslighting. No one meant to harm her. That's why it kept happening. She wasn't unlucky. She fit a gap that no one had warned her about. Nobody had told her she was a demographic with a known blind spot. They told her she was anxious. Most people don't notice this part. The moment someone stops talking about their pain, not because it's improved, because talking about it has become more exhausting than having it. That silence is what the system reads as progress. Her tests came back normal. That's why she stayed quiet. By year 2, the diagnosis problem had become an identity problem. She stopped telling friends when she was struggling. Not for privacy, because she'd watched their faces move through the same sequence too many times. Concern, discomfort, and then, as if they'd prescribed it, the gentle suggestion. Yoga, therapy, cutting out inflammatory foods. She already knew what they'd say, word for word, before they said it. So she skipped it. Inside the appointments, she stopped pushing. The list she'd prepared the night before disappeared before she left the house. Because once, that list had been returned to her, gently, as evidence of how closely she was monitoring her symptoms. The monitoring, apparently, was part of the problem. She was no longer asking what was wrong. She was learning how to sound acceptable. That shift sounds small. It isn't. She started tracking her pain on a scale of 1 to 10, not to show the doctor, to convince herself it was real enough to mention. Some days she didn't note it down, not because it was better, because a 6 didn't feel like it earned an appointment. And at some point, this is the part no one admits, you stop trusting what your own body reports. Not because the symptoms have disappeared, because you've been told often enough that your experience is unreliable that you begin cross-examining it first. Maybe this is just my baseline. Maybe everyone carries this and doesn't mention it. Maybe. The thing about maybe is that it never resolves. It just becomes the weather. The room got easier when she doubted herself. Nobody designed it that way. That's exactly how it works. By year 3, something had already broken. She was no longer asking, "What's wrong with me?" She was asking something more corrosive. How do I describe this in a way they won't dismiss again? Once your pain has to pass a preemptive edit, once you've internalized the standard of proof required before your own body is allowed to speak, the system has moved inside you. Year 3. Claire requested a rheumatology referral. Dr. Hoffman said it wasn't indicated. Her markers were borderline but stable. He adjusted her iron prescription and recommended, again without visible malice, that she speak to someone about the anxiety. She thanked him, then sat in her car. 11 minutes. Not because she was broken, because she was calculating whether to push back, whether it would be recorded, whether being recorded as difficult would affect every appointment that followed. She thought about the note Dr. Hoffman might write, the word persistent used as a diagnosis, the way that word in a medical file has a way of following a person into every room where someone is supposed to help them. She started the engine. She drove home with a prescription for her brain when what was wrong was her body. If you'd asked Claire at the end of that year whether the medical system had failed her, she would have said no. She would have said her doctors were trying their best. She would have meant it. And she would have been wrong. Her tests came back normal. That's why the system kept reading her as low priority. By then, her hands didn't look like hers anymore. She'd noticed that. And then she'd noticed that she'd stopped noticing. The breaking point didn't look like a breaking point. It looked like a Tuesday evening parent-teacher conference. 3 hours on her feet. Shoes she'd worn 100 times. By 7 p.m., she looked down. The rings she'd put on that morning were cutting into swollen fingers. A parent, someone she was meeting for the first time, noticed before she did. "Are you all right?" they said, quietly. She looked at her hands. She drove directly to A&E. The doctor there was someone she'd never seen. He looked at her hands, looked at her face, asked a series of questions she had answered many times before. Then, simply, "How long has this been going on?" 4 years. He stopped writing. She noticed he didn't follow up with a qualifier. Didn't suggest she might be confusing duration with intensity. Didn't glance at the screen and reframe the question. He just picked up the phone and ordered the panel. She sat on the edge of the bed and realized she didn't know what to do when a room didn't push back. He ran a panel she had never been offered. What it showed was not nothing. It had never been nothing. An autoimmune condition, one she'd likely had from the beginning, had been progressing quietly while she learned to describe herself in smaller and smaller words. Her tests had come back normal. She just hadn't been. The rheumatologist was calm and direct. Her condition had a name, a treatment. He saw it all the time. She didn't know it existed. She told him, 4 years. He wasn't surprised. She was. "I know," he said. He didn't minimize it, didn't offer an explanation that made the 4 years feel like an accident. He just moved forward to the treatment plan, the medication schedule, the follow-up appointments, as if her experience of the last 4 years was precisely what it had been. She noticed she kept waiting for the qualifier, for the "but" that would soften the diagnosis, reopen the question, give the previous 9 appointments some retroactive credibility. It didn't come. She sat in that office a long time after he left, not crying, just taking something back that she hadn't known they'd taken. Dr. Hoffman never knew. No complaint, no letter, no indication that Claire's story had ended anywhere other than where he'd expected. Somewhere in the weeks after her diagnosis, she thought about calling his practice, not to report him, just to say, the borderline markers were something. They were always something. She didn't call. She already knew how that conversation would be recorded. He is almost certainly still practicing, still careful, still considered, still suggesting to certain patients that speaking to someone might help. The next woman sitting in that office, with her careful qualifications and her list of symptoms and her willingness to say, "It's probably nothing." She doesn't know any of this yet. And this is what stayed with her. Not the 4 years, not even the damage. The real injury wasn't the delay. It was what the delay taught her to do to her own perception. Even now, diagnosed, treated, managed, she describes a version of herself she can't quite reach. Someone who noticed something felt wrong and simply believed it. She still edits before she speaks. Still adds, "but I'm managing," to sentences that didn't need it. 4 years of appointments taught her the grammar of being bearable to a room. The diagnosis didn't unteach that. That voice, the one that says, "Are you sure?" and "probably nothing," and "you've been wrong before." It doesn't sound like Dr. Hoffman anymore. It sounds like her. The same pattern doesn't stay in clinics. Dismiss, minimize, pathologize, repeat. It appears wherever one person holds authority over another person's account of their own experience. In therapy, in workplaces, in relationships, where the person adjusting your sense of what's real has been doing it since before you knew there was a word for it. That one's next. If someone came to your mind while watching this, there's a reason for that. Her tests came back normal. She just never was.